Okay, we'll get started. Welcome back to day 2 of this series of short conversations with people whose knowledge and experience will support your teaching and your organizing in the struggle for a free Palestine and the right to return, and against the ongoing U.S.-Israeli colonization, occupation, settlement, and genocide, a century in the making. Please come and go over the course of the day as you wish. I want to extend many thank yous to Elon Dancy and Christy McGuire of the Center for Urban Education for collaborating to create this event. Nakia Washington Butler, Fiona Seals, Kelly Runko, and Caitlin Zerker for tech support. My daughters for quickly training me in social media. My dear friends and colleagues, Uju Agarwal and Lisa Ortiz, for helping generously in the shaping of these conversations, and everyone who helped to circulate this event widely. As of start time, we had 230 people registered. So you all are amazing, and thank you for being here today. I'm Sabina Vaught, and I was going to be welcoming Sharif Zagout of the Arab Resource and Organizing Center. Sharif is currently at the Port of Tacoma as part of the Organizing Center's direct action campaign, Block the Boat. So if you look up Block the Boat on social media, you'll see that on Friday, for many hours, they successfully blocked a ship at the Port of Oakland that was carrying weaponry to Israel. And they're now in Tacoma, where the ship was attempting to dock and undertaking direct action there. So Sharif will not be able to join us today, but we send him our wishes for his safety and for a strong collective campaign of direct action in the Port of Tacoma. We do hope to invite him back, so please be on the lookout. We'll be sending out more information. And please do look up the Arab Resource and Organizing Center, which has had many campaigns over the years, including Stop Urban Shield, which was successful in winning and blocking the war games in the Bay Area that included Israeli military and U.S. police and military. We are really lucky, however, because Dr. Neda Elia agreed to join us early and to talk longer in support of your learning and in support of Sharif's direct action efforts this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. Dr. Elia is a core member of the Palestinian Feminist Collective. She currently teaches Arab American Studies at Western Washington University and previously chaired Global Studies at Antioch University, Seattle. Among her many other books and publications, Dr. Elia is the author of Greater Than the Sum of Our Parts, Feminism, Internationalism, and Palestine, and Palestine, a Socialist Introduction. She's a regular contributor to Mondoweiss and Middle East Eye, where she publishes editorials about Palestine, gender, activism, and transnational struggles. She was a member of the Insight editorial team that put out the famous and for many of us life-altering book, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. Dr. Elia, thank you for joining us and for sharing what's been your life's work in these very difficult times. We know you've had a lifelong dedication to liberation, and we're grateful to be with you today.
Thank you for having me, but mostly thank you for organizing this, and thank you for your outspokenness and directness and no mincing words as you explain what is going on. This is not a conflict, this is genocide. And so thank you so much for being open about acknowledging the reality of what we're going through.
Absolutely. Why don't we jump into conversation? And again, thank you for being flexible and for being willing to start us off today. I wonder if we might get right into one of your very powerful arguments. You've argued that Palestinian liberation can't be won by the abolition of the Israeli apartheid state alone, but that the supremacist ideology of Zionism must be undone entirely. And I wonder if you can talk through that with our organizer, educator, participants today, and help them think about how you are observing and making sense of that.
Sure. I mean, for me, it's very, very simple. It's reform versus abolition. We cannot reform Zionism. We cannot reform a system that is corrupt. We cannot reform a system that is racist. We need to abolish it. But before I get into that, I'm going to actually explain some of the context, because I understand that we're talking to educators. And as an educator, I'm going to explain the context. So first, I actually want to acknowledge the reality of apartheid and the belated acknowledgement. And I want to appreciate the belated acknowledgement by numerous international human rights organizations that Israel is a full-fledged apartheid state, not a vibrant democracy. We've been told over and over again that it's a vibrant democracy, it's the only democracy in the Middle East. It is an apartheid state. And that's something finally human rights organizations other than the Palestinians have acknowledged that. And that's important, right? Of course, Palestinians have always known that Israel is an apartheid state. And it is actually Palestinian civil rights organizations such as Al-Haq and Al-Damir that have documented and done the research behind Israel's apartheid practices that these organizations finally get credit for, like Amnesty International's report, Human Rights Watch, B'Tselem. More recently, even Harvard University has declared Israel an apartheid state, not a democracy, not the only democracy in the Middle East, nothing vibrant about it. But that's something that we have said for decades. I mean, we knew it from day one that Israel is an apartheid state. And I'm trying to explain that to say why it is that we need to abolish apartheid, absolutely. But we also need to understand that it is not a recent development. It's not something that Israel engaged in recently. And so we fix that and there's no problem, right? We Palestinians have lived under apartheid from the very minute Israel was created as a Jewish state through an act of Western imperialism. When Western imperialism first determined that, when Israel first determined that its Jewish citizens should be served by civilian law, while the non-Jewish citizens, the indigenous Palestinians, would come under military law. So from day one, Israel was an apartheid state. And I say that again because it's important to notice there are so many people who say that in 2018, with the Jewish nation state law, basic law that the Knesset passed in 2018, that's when Israel became an apartheid state. It was approaching apartheid. It was getting close to apartheid, and then it became an apartheid. No, it was an apartheid state from the day it was founded. We've known, like it was an apartheid state when Palestinians were under military law and Jews were under Jewish Israelis were under civilian law. We've known it's apartheid when our right of return, asserted in December 1948, has been denied to us in order to secure a Jewish majority in our ancestral homeland. So apartheid is not a recent development. With that said, there's also the understanding of apartheid is very frequently reduced strictly to the legal system that privileges members of one ethnic or racial group while over others and disenfranchises the others. But here's the deal: apartheid would not exist without settler colonialism. And Israel is not only an apartheid state, it is a settler colonial country. That's something that needs to be very clear. And so abolishing one of the systems of oppression without the other can't possibly lead to liberation. That's where intersectional analysis comes in. That's why we have to understand abolishing the legal system of apartheid without abolishing settler colonialism would not result in liberation. Because just like apartheid, settler colonialism also hinges on supremacist ideology. The idea that you can create a new country on the ruins of another is grounded in the belief of the disposability of the indigenous people. That belief is racist, it is supremacist. When we know that Israel was founded on the ruins of 500 Palestinian towns and villages, when we know that Israel was founded on the ethnic cleansing of almost 80% of the Palestinian people, the displacement of that people of 80% of the Palestinian people who have been refugees ever since, who have not been allowed to return, despite United Nations resolution, despite the right of return being enshrined in the Declaration of Universal Human Rights, that's because that's racism, that's supremacist settler colonialism at the service of apartheid. So what we need to abolish is not only apartheid, but the racist ideology behind settler colonialism, behind supremacist settler colonialism. So again, I do insist that Palestinian liberation cannot come only through the legal abolition of apartheid, without decolonization, without land back, without the right of return. These are essential aspects of decolonization. We are colonized people who have been subjected to apartheid. Removing apartheid without removing settler colonialism does not make us free, right? So, and one of the things that we always look at in the Palestinian struggle, especially with the call for BDS, which is modeled upon the call for global solidarity in the form of boycotts that South Africa issued in 1959, which only became popular and global as a movement in the 80s. When we look at South Africa, we look at it as an inspiration, but we must also look at South Africa as a cautionary tale. The fact is, apartheid was officially abolished in South Africa, but the racist supremacist ideology behind the European colonization of South Africa was not abolished. And what we now have in what is officially post-apartheid South Africa is the ongoing legacy of that settler colonialism and racist supremacy. We have the income gap between Black and white has not gotten any smaller. The living conditions of the indigenous Black people are as dismal as they were under apartheid. South Africa today is the country with the highest rates of sexual violence. It's called the rape capital of the world. It's not a capital, it's a country, but it's like the rates of sexual violence, the rates of poverty, how much women have actually suffered. Again, gendered violence of settler colonialism. These are the things that we need to look at also when we look at South Africa, where South Africa did indeed abolish apartheid, but there was no decolonization in process. And so that's something that we need to keep in mind when we say that, looking at Israel, at Palestine, simply abolishing apartheid without abolishing Zionism, which is a supremacist, racist, settler colonial ideology, will not result in liberation. So with that understanding, we must also understand that our dispossession, again, did not begin with the 2018 Jewish nation-state law. It began with Zionist ideology even before Israel was created. And Zionism must be understood as that racist colonial ideology. And it must be understood as a racist colonial ideology that is not exclusive to Jewish people. That's really important. I mean, Joe Biden is a Zionist, we know that. Donald Trump is a Zionist. My Christian neighbor who's flying an Israeli flag is a Zionist, right? So the idea, it's that Western racist, colonial, imperial ideology that believes in the dehumanism, that believes that indigenous people have no rights to sovereignty, completely dehumanized, completely disposable. That is the ideology that must be abolished. Or if not fully abolished, because there's always going to be bigots in the world, it cannot be enabled, it cannot be allowed to be the ideology that is in power. So that's where I make the distinction between, you don't only abolish apartheid, you also abolish the ideology that is the framework for that.
Yeah, thank you for sort of teasing out your arguments and laying out that framework for organizers and educators on the call. And I wonder if you might talk about ways in which educators and organizers, perhaps people are new to organizing or wanting to be in solidarity with struggles, how might they understand long-standing Palestinian struggles for abolishing ideologies of supremacy, for abolishing Zionism? Sort of how might people think about their engagement, particularly if they're learning and relatively new to understanding the situation?
I think the main issue is to de-exceptionalize Israel and de-exceptionalize Palestine. It's really important. There is nothing unique about Israel. Just like there was, it's like it's any settler colonial country. Israel is modeled upon the USA, Israel is modeled upon South Africa, all of these settler colonial countries. Let's not exceptionalize Israel. Yes, Israel was the immediate impetus of Israel was European anti-Semitism, right? But Israel is a settler colonial country and must not be exceptionalized. There is nothing exceptional about it. When we look at apartheid, when we look at settler colonialism, when we look at imperialism, when we look at racism, there's nothing exceptional. Similarly, there's nothing exceptional about the Palestinian people. We are an indigenous dispossessed people. And so it's very important to stop exceptionalizing that, because it's only when you exceptionalize it, only when you say that Israel is the only safe space for Jews, rather than, hey, let's deal with anti-Semitism in the US, let's deal with anti-Semitism in Europe, right? It's only when you think of the Palestinian people not as yet one more indigenous, dispossessed, colonized people fighting for their rights, fighting for their sovereignty. I mean, the idea that we can be in support, that we can say occupation is wrong everywhere except in Palestine, apartheid is wrong everywhere except in Palestine, decolonization, yeah, everywhere except in Palestine. We want the liberation of indigenous people everywhere, like people who went to Standing Rock to stand in support of indigenous sovereignty. Why are they not doing it in Palestine? So I think we have to de-exceptionalize. The first thing we have to do is de-exceptionalize. And that's where you start seeing that our struggle is an anti-imperialist struggle, an anti-racist struggle, an anti-colonial struggle, an anti-occupation struggle, an anti-militarism struggle, an anti-incarceration struggle, a refugees' right to people to return, economic refugees, genocide, environmental racism, all of these things. Once you start seeing that there's nothing exceptional about the Palestinian people and about Israel, except that it is one more manifestation of settler colonialism, then you can start understanding what our struggle is about.
And you mentioned, in talking about South Africa, for instance, the ways in which gender-based violence is a part of understanding colonization, settler colonialism, imperialism, supremacy, and its undoing. And I wonder, this is also part of your life's work, to think about and enact Palestinian feminism and intersectionality. And I wonder if we could shift to hearing from you about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it has been my life's work, and I'm a Palestinian feminist. I believe that Palestinian feminism is an indigenous feminism, and like all women of color feminism, Palestinian feminism is intersectional and it is anti-colonial. It's, you can examine every system separately, but the fact is they coexist and you have to address them simultaneously. As Palestinian feminists, me and my sisters in the Palestinian Feminist Collective, my women of color sisters in Insight, Women of Color Against Violence, we understand that there can be no free nation without free women, but also, which is a slogan that Talat first came up with a few years ago, no free nation without free women. And Palestinian Feminist Collective has adopted that. There can be no free nation without free women, but also that women cannot be free in an occupied, colonized nation. I mean, it's impossible, so there's Western liberal feminism that says they want to liberate us from our local oppressors without looking at the macro level of oppression. It's like, liberate us from Arab Muslim patriarchy, but still be occupied by Israel, right? Like, how can we be free? And we've seen that again and again and again. Like, for example, the French feminists who thought they were liberating Algerian women by rounding them up and stripping them of their veil. They wanted to liberate them of the veil, but not of French occupation, right? So it's like, how can you can't be no free nation without free women, but also no free women in an occupied, colonized nation. So how can we address only one aspect when we are subjected to the macro level of violence, which is colonialism and occupation? So we understand as Palestinian feminists that we cannot be free until we liberate ourselves, our people, our nation, our land, from both Zionist, from all of the above: Zionist violence, oppression, the occupation, and the occupation of our public and private life. That is our intersectional understanding of liberation. We cannot be free in an occupied land. We cannot free the nation without freeing the women. So, and Palestinian feminism hinges on a commitment to achieving Palestinian social and political liberation, by confronting all systemic gendered, sexual, and colonial violence and oppression and dispossession simultaneously. There's no first things first. Every time throughout history where we've seen a first things first, let's liberate the nation and then we'll take care of the women. Well, women are part of the nation. And usually when you liberate the nation without having liberated the women, you're not ending up with a liberated nation, right? So it has to be addressed simultaneously. We are liberating ourselves from gendered, sexual, colonial violence and oppression and dispossession and patriarchy at the same time. And that's a project that I think all women of color or indigenous women, feminists, are engaged in. And so it has to be done at the same time. And when we look at our communities, we don't look at individual circumstances, because we understand that we cannot be free when our community is not free. We are oppressed by colonialism. We understand that colonialism is a form of gendered violence. This is not especially true. I don't want to exceptionalize, but for example, speaking of what it's like in Israel, Israel does see us as the demographic threat. We are the procreators of the nation. We are considered a demographic threat, and Israel has been very, very intentional in its attacks on Palestinian women's reproductive freedom. And there's a long history that can be documented of, colonizers and the attacks on the indigenous people's reproductive freedom. I mean, we have seen it on Turtle Island, absolutely, and we see its legacy, its ongoing continuation to this day, with the disproportionate rates of sexual violence within indigenous communities as a result of the legacy of colonialism, the legacy of the gendered violence of the boarding schools, the legacy of the violence of colonialism. There's and we see that, again, looking at South Africa, it's a horrific situation. But to speak specifically about Palestine, already under the British mandate, Palestine was trying to control women's reproductive justice by basically preventing traditional ways of the traditional midwives. Palestinian traditional midwife is called a daya. They were trying to ban the dayas when Israel occupied the West Bank in 1967, the West Bank in Gaza. One of the first things that Israel did is it actually stopped issuing licenses for the traditional Palestinian midwives, the dayats. It stopped issuing licenses, so anyone caught practicing traditional midwifery was fined, gone to jail, take away the license, and no new women could become daya. They could no longer practice. So they banned the practice of traditional midwives, but in 1967 with the occupation. And while they did that, they made it harder for Palestinian women to actually access hospitals. It's not out of concern, oh, the traditional ways are bad, so we're going to improve your ways and we're going to create hospitals and medical centers. Actually, they made it even harder because the hospitals are only in the urban centers. Palestinian women are everywhere. Palestinian families and communities are everywhere. And there are over 500 checkpoints within the West Bank alone, right? So women giving birth was no longer possible or legal for that matter. In your home, you had to go to the hospital, you had to go through checkpoints, and women are, and being, in labor when you're 9 months pregnant, that's physical. So it's not like, oh, the soldier at the checkpoint didn't see that. You have a woman in labor at the checkpoint being detained. Women have died giving birth. Newborn infants have died upon being delivered. And that is one way of controlling reproductive freedom. And when you think of, all of the gendered violence of Israel, and I could go on and I could talk, and maybe I will talk more since I have more time now about the gendered violence of Israel. For me, it's like so outrageous that Western liberal feminists can be outraged at, the Taliban's violence against women, but not Israel's violence against women. Like, why do we want to liberate women from the Taliban, but not from Israel, when Israel is engaging in a similar kind of violence, right? So, that's one example. For example, the denial of licenses for traditional midwives and the making it impossible to get to checkpoints, and women dying at checkpoints, and women giving birth at checkpoints, and the infants dying at checkpoints. That's part of reproductive justice. Of course, we're talking today with this intensifying genocide in Gaza. And I want to say that I always say intensifying because the genocide did not start on October 7th. The genocide started in 1948, with the displacement of the people, with the massacres, with all of the massacres upon which Israel is founded. That's the genocide, and it has been ongoing, and it intensifies at periods. And this is a peak, absolutely a peak, but it is not, it didn't start on October 7th. It started in 1947-48. So today we have a very similar situation of a complete denial of reproductive justice, because of course it's intensifying genocide. So right now, today in the Gaza Strip, we have 50,000 pregnant women. Of these 50,000 pregnant women, 5,500 are due to give birth within the next month. And, in addition, like over 4,000 children have been killed in the past month from Israeli bombing, right? 5,500 women are due to give birth in the next month or so in the Gaza Strip. Many are miscarrying as a result of the tension. Many in both Gaza and the West Bank are miscarrying. The ones who are not miscarrying are going to give birth in the most unsanitary situations, with no medical equipment, no water, no food. That's a denial of reproductive justice. Women are having C-sections now as we speak without medical equipment. Okay, so, we have basically that, it is part of genocide, but genocide is gendered violence, and these are some of the manifestations of gendered violence. There are other manifestations of gendered violence, like I could speak about pinkwashing, for example, and pinkwashing is Israel's projection of itself as gay-friendly, except, and it is not gay. Again, it's the selective humanity of who we care for. Just like there's a selective outrage at women who are oppressed by some powers but not others, here there's also a selective acceptance of which gays are acceptable or not. So Israel pretends to be gay friendly, and I do say pretend because Israel is not a gay friendly country. There are some pockets. Tel Aviv is relatively gay friendly for European gay men, right? It's not even all that inclusive. So, but this pink washing is basically, Palestine is no more conservative and no more patriarchal than any other country. Whether that country is Israel, the US, France, Brazil, you name it, we're not more conservative, we're not more patriarchal. I mean, I can think of the US Supreme Court today, which denies us our most basic bodily sovereignty and integrity. So, like, between the US Supreme Court and the Taliban, I don't know, or even, anyway. So I want to say that Palestine is not more conservative, it's not more patriarchal, but it is conservative and patriarchal, yes. And what Israel, which pretends to be gay friendly, does is actually, rather than be friendly to Palestinian gays, it exploits Palestinian gays. It exploits the conservatism within Palestinian society, so that, for example, it threatens to out Palestinian gays to their communities if they don't collaborate with Israel. That's not being gay friendly. That's exploiting homophobia in order, at the service of apartheid, at the service of colonialism, at the service of militarism, at the service of occupation. That is not gay friendly. There is no pink door in the apartheid wall. Israel does not say, okay, you can go through the checkpoints. Israel doesn't stop to ask you if you're gay or not before denying you the right of return. It's not like, oh, we're gay friendly, okay, Palestinian gays can come back. No Palestinian, gay, straight, woman, child, man, adult, poor, rich. Israel basically is very selective in which gays it is friendly to, and that's only when it serves its purposes, and that's not being gay friendly, right? So there's the acceptable gays and there's the unacceptable gays, and Palestinians are the unacceptable gays. And still there's this propaganda that Israel is gay friendly, and that's pink washing, and that's gendered violence, because it actually is gendered violence, and it exploits the circumstances of Palestinians in order to further serve empire and racism. So, I mean, I could go on about gendered violence, but so as Palestinian feminists, we understand that, and we understand that it is part and parcel of settler colonialism, that is part and parcel of Zionism, that is part and parcel of imperialism, and that it is part and parcel of our liberation struggle, and that we have to fight all these fronts at the same time in order to be free.
If you want to go on, I think you're making so many important interventions that I know you've written about and talked about for a very long time, but I do think for people on our call, some of this invitation to reframe, to name things as they are. So name Joe Biden as a Zionist. He's a Zionist. To name the sort of equivalencies and resonances among the Taliban, the US, Israel, to be asking educators to look at what is and what is practiced as a way of fighting propaganda and imperialism seems so important. And I wonder, at this, I think you used the word intensified genocide. We've been saying accelerated genocide, this sort of beyond words horror that's occurring right now. That's you gave the examples of some of the ways in which it amplifies gender-based violence. The genocide is gender-based violence. I do want to make space. I'm certain that people on this call would love to hear more if there are other ways in which you want to help all of us understand or encourage us to act, look, speak, learn. I think that we'd be grateful. So
maybe taking questions rather than me just going on and talking some more. I mean, I can talk, but maybe like to be specific, like, understanding that Israel is not exceptional, understanding that Israeli occupation and colonialism have manifestations of gendered violence, understanding that if we are concerned about the plight of women and gays in other countries, then we should be concerned about that in Israel, and not buy into Israeli propaganda. See the reality, you know. Yeah, I mean, I'll take questions. I don't know if what else I mean, yeah, I could talk, but as I said, I think it may be best to actually have some questions.
Yeah. And I just wrote to, everyone on this call, if you have questions, send them to us via the chat. And we're happy to respond or pose those questions.
Okay, well,
Hi, Erica. Thank you.
okay, so I want to, go back to not exceptionalizing Palestine, because I think that's the most empowering call for solidarity, is do not exceptionalize Palestine. I mean, I think of myself as a Palestinian in the far diaspora, and as a Palestinian in the far diaspora, I could think of myself as like a stateless refugee, or I could think of myself, and again, the intersectionality, which I find very empowering, like, what do I have in common with others? Because we need the numbers, right? So, okay, I'm a refugee. There are other refugees. I'm an immigrant. I'm subjected to colonialism. I'm a survivor of state violence. I'm a survivor of dispossession. I'm survivor, incarceration. I'm an abolitionist. I'm a prison abolitionist. I'm a police abolitionist. And when you start thinking again of all the connections you have with other communities, that to me is intersection analysis, but it's also the more empowering thing, because we're all little minorities. If we think only exclusively, that's where I say do not exceptionalize. If we think exclusively of what is unique to our circumstances, I mean, I could be just like thinking of what's unique to my circumstances. And of course, there are things that are unique to my circumstances. There are things that are unique to the circumstances of every single community. But when we start looking in a broader analysis at like what it is we have in common, incarceration, criminalization, the way I think of it is, if the police come, are they going to view us as criminals or as the people that they need to protect, right? And there's this whole mass of people that are viewed as criminals for whatever reason: brown and black skinned people, and disabled people, and mentally ill people, and poor people. That's what we have in common. And let's not look at our differences as much and unique circumstances, even though I would not deny that there are unique circumstances to each community. But once we start looking at what we have in common, and when we come together, and that's why I say don't exceptionalize, come together. That's how we can win. That's how we ended up with the numbers in the streets. That's how we can form a front that eventually realize we have the numbers. Oh, okay.
Yeah, you've got some questions.
I got some questions. All right.
And they seem like maybe they can overlap a little bit.
Yeah. So the indigeneity of Zionism, Palestinians are a racially and religiously diverse people. We do not believe in an ethno-nationalist, exclusivist country. Many Zionists are European colonizers. There's always been a Jewish presence in Palestine, and that Jewish presence is not a settler colonial presence. But the fact that, for example, Ivanka Trump can convert to Judaism because she married Jared Kushner and then becomes Jewish and has the right of return, that's not an indigenous return, right? So, again, think of the reality rather than the myth. when someone converts to Judaism and has greater rights to the land than me, and I do not have that right, that's not indigeneity. That's colonialism.
And I think Dr. Neber was with us on Friday, and she shared sort of the history of Palestine had, of course, people in it who were Palestinian, who were Arab Jews, very different from European Jews, who don't have any ancestry, and that's that supremacist state. So I think there are ways for people on the call to kind of look into that history in your work, in Dr. Neber's work. It's Nadine Neber, and we'll put her name in the chat as well, to sort of understand who was where when.
Yeah, I'm glad she did that. I mean, again, I didn't think that I would. I know that I didn't have to provide that context because there were speakers before me. But yeah, I mean, the whole idea, Israel will engage in any propaganda tactic it can. So there's the pink washing, there's the green washing, that they're environmentally friendly. For example, that the army, the Israeli occupation forces, is very vegan friendly. So its soldiers can wear leather-free boots and wool-free berets and leather-free, and it's like, yeah, but they're still killing, right? I mean, they're vegans who kill. That again is the dehumanization of Palestinians, to the point where you can actually pride yourself on being a vegan-friendly army that slaughters Palestinians. So that's greenwashing. Red washing is the claim to indigeneity. Pink washing is the claim to being gay friendly. Look at the reality, okay, where else? All right. I'm going to address the question about BDS, and I'm realizing now that there are so many questions. So, because I was also an organizer, a BDS organizer for many long years, and I'm still totally a BDS organizer, but anyway, among the many balls that I juggle. So BDS, basically, I think the success of BDS is primarily that it was so educational. It actually established the Palestinian anti-colonial, anti-apartheid struggle alongside that of South Africa, which was viewed as a just struggle, a just cause, right? So BDS, by saying this is our model, that's what we ask of you, that was a huge thing for Palestine and for people who wanted to be in solidarity. At the same time, what BDS, so I want to emphasize the educational role of BDS. Why are you engaging in BDS against Israel? Well, BDS has 3 demands, right? And the occupation, which is illegal, right of return, which is a legal right, dismantle the apartheid wall, and equal rights for all. Really, I mean, for that to be viewed as radical, when basically all that the BDS is asking for is for Israel to stop violating international law and the human rights of the Palestinians. And so BDS was, it's like really simple demands. Stop violating international law, stop violating the human rights of the Palestinians. The occupation is illegal, it must be ended. The apartheid wall is illegal, it must be dismantled. The Palestinians have a right to return, it must be respected, and Palestinians within Israel should have equal rights. For that to be viewed as a threat, that already exposed Israel as a country that cannot deal with justice. So BDS is really important, and that's why the efforts to silence it, the efforts to criminalize it, the efforts to make it illegal in some countries to be a public employee, a state employee, having pledged that you would respect BDS. So, I mean, I think it's very much a case of explaining that these are our demands. Our demands are international law, that Israel respect international law. If that is too much, then you're on the side of the wrong side, period, right? I mean, we're not asking for much. We're not asking for, I mean, basic, really, for BDS to be viewed as an existential threat. When BDS is asking for justice, justice can only be a threat to injustice. And so it exposes Israel as a country founded on and maintained through injustice. How do we talk to our politicians about that? I think explaining that basically, because so many of our politicians actually do not know the issues. They don't, right? So when you actually ask them, what are the demands of BDS, international law? Are you saying that we should not ask a country to abide by international law? I mean, it's really important to actually discuss these things and be clear about the fact that BDS is asking for international law to be respected.
I wonder if, Dylan Rodriguez was with us at the end of the day on Friday, and we talked about this sort of tension of sort of decolonization and anti-colonialism with things like mobilizing international law or the United Nations. And he said, he can observe the United Nations as a global cop force. It's a global policing force that's not legitimate. And how can you use it in the moment? And I wonder if you might talk about how in various organizing, Insight, Palestinian Feminist Collective, across all this work you've done, BDS, how do you think about the relationship? You started by saying, critiquing reformism and pushing toward multiple abolitionist sort of efforts that are intersectional. How do we think about movements that ask for a state that maybe is illegitimate and should be abolished, to also currently abide by laws, commitments, et cetera? So what's the tension that people work through, particularly in Palestinian feminist organizing contexts?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very, very good point. I bring up international law, I bring up the UN, knowing how deeply flawed they are, very deeply flawed. And, it is the United Nations that facilitated the creation of a supremacist settler colonial state. It is the United Nations that did that. Right. So I mean, like how deep, how much more flawed can you be? And how, like, the master's tools will not dismantle the master's house, right? And we're looking at the master's tools. We're looking at the fact that it is the United Nations that created Israel. And now we look at international law according to the United Nations, right? So obviously there's that. So, and I am an abolitionist, not a reformist. And as if you look at Mariam Kaba's work, she says, like, okay, what are the reforms that we can think of that are acceptable, that do not actually strengthen the police system? Those are reforms there are like the temporary measures that are reforms, but there are reforms that you should never accept, right? So again, I can't summarize Kaba in this is my little summary of Kaba. What reforms are acceptable that do not strengthen the system? We're looking at a similar thing. And as an abolitionist, as Kaba is an abolitionist, as Palestinian feminists who are abolitionists, abolitionists know that part of the solution is to constantly be already creating the alternative while working on abolition. And that's something that Palestinian feminists are engaged in, 100% engaged in. We are in a very dystopic moment. We are calling for the abolition, and it's not, and then after that, what do? We are working on the alternative. We are creating the alternative in our communities. And I don't want to say only the Palestinian Feminist Collective, even though the Palestinian Feminist Collective is very much engaged in creating the alternative. It's what we're doing. It's like, we are very intentional about that. But I would say that Palestinians, who are developing these, sustainable farming, seed harvesting, foraging, that's already the alternative. So yes, abolition, yes, reform, only those reforms that can serve and not strengthen the system. The master's tools will not dismantle the master's house. We are creating the alternative as we abolish the oppressive system.
Thank you for that. That was a beautiful and moving. You've been on with us for a long time, and I know that we can't imagine how hard this time must be for you and your family, your loved ones. And our hearts are with you, our spirits are with you, our struggle is with you, and we're just so grateful. I want to if there's anything you want to say in closing, I want to give you space to do that.
Please speak out. Please continue to speak out. I mean, I know that there are some amazing questions that I cannot address because, yes, I've been speaking for 50 minutes, let's say. So I can't address all the questions, but I do know about one that, like, how do one question somewhere is like, how do we speak despite the censorship? Please speak out, right? I mean, and I do it, and what I tell myself every morning is I may lose my livelihood, others are losing their lives, right? I don't necessarily want to say everyone go ahead and lose your livelihood because others are losing their lives. This is my own philosophy, if you want, but use your privilege if you have it. Speak out. There is a genocide going on. We can't think of like, oh, mincing words. We can't. We've been mincing words for decades, right? The genocide is intensifying. Now is the time. Now is the time for everything, from direct action to shut down, to walk out, to speak up. Now is the time. Honestly, it's like people are dying as we speak, right? In great numbers. And now is the time to speak out.
Thank you for that. And I'll repeat something we said on Friday. Dr. Dancy, who was one of the co-creators of this event, and I have shared, and Dylan Rodriguez has shared, people who are more vulnerable come to those of us who are less vulnerable in our rank or position, and those of us who should risk our jobs. So I think move collectively as well, so that you're not isolated. We know that students in particular are the targets of some pretty extraordinary violence right now. And so move collectively, come to us, let us take risks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. We are so grateful for your time with us, for your sharing really your life's work in such moving and beautiful and brilliant ways. And thank you. And I know everyone's sending hearts and thanking you. And so I hope you feel the gratitude on the call.
I see it. And thank you again. Thank you so much for organizing this. Thank you.
Absolutely. We will be back in 15 minutes at, let's see, it'll be 3:10 Eastern time, with Donna Neville, who is a long-standing Jewish for Peace organizer. So again, thank you for Dr. Elia for being with us, and join us back in 15 minutes for further conversation.
Bye.
Take good care. Welcome back to day 2 of this series of short conversations with people whose knowledge and experience will support your teaching and organizing in the struggle for a free Palestine and the right of return, and against the ongoing U.S.-Israeli colonization, occupation, settlement, and genocide, a century in the making. Please feel free to come and go over the course of the day. I'm Sabina Vaught, and I'm very honored to be welcoming Donna Neville, who's a community psychologist, educator, and organizer. She's a founding member of Facing the Nakba Project and Jews Say No, and the Network Against Islamophobia. She co-created Jews Against Anti-Muslim Racism and was co-founder of Jews for Racial and Economic Justice. She has taught for many years at NYU. She writes and lectures widely on Palestine and Israel, Islamophobia, and organizing for justice. Please read Donna's work across numerous outlets such as Truth Out, the Boston Review, and many others. Donna, thank you for taking time to join us today in the midst of what I am observing is an incredibly busy organizing and activist schedule for you.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me here with you. I'm really pleased to be here.
Well, I wanted to start, if we could, by sharing that I believe your understanding and perspective as a community psychologist will be really profound for people on the call, particularly for educators. And I imagine there are many people who would really benefit from hearing about your organizing over time and in the current moment from that perspective. And really anything you want to share just to sort of get us going and thinking about that long work on the part of Jewish organizations in the struggle for Palestinian liberation.
Sure. So in addition to being part of a number of different groups and coalitions that have been organizing for justice in Palestine, I've also been part of a number of Jewish groups throughout the many years I've been involved with this issue. And I've worked with Jewish groups really for a few different reasons. One is that I just think it's important to have a voice that disrupts the mainstream Jewish narrative and the Israeli narrative that all Jews agree with them. And we can see by this, if we haven't known this beforehand, I think we can see by what's been going on these past few weeks that is very much not the case, that most Jews are in alignment with the government. I also think that for me, I consider it my responsibility to work within my community. I think that's just a responsibility, and not everybody wants to be doing that work. And I always say, if one doesn't want to, don't, but it is something that's meaningful to me. And also, I actually think being part of a Jewish organization, the way like JVP, Jewish Voice for Peace, or others, is that it's really the best way to be accountable to a broader movement and to a Palestinian-led movement, and to be able to work with as much like integrity and principle as possible. So those are kind of the reasons that I've chosen as part of my organizing over these years to do it within like these Jewish spaces. And all the groups that I've been part of, certainly in the past many years, have worked in very close partnership with Palestinian and other racial justice groups. And just to share a few of the groups I'm part of now, because they've all been like different but overlapping experiences. As I'm living in Miami, Florida. And so I'm part of Jewish Voice for Peace, South Florida. And obviously that presents its own challenges, being in a fascist state. And so that's part of what we consider in our organizing. And as part of that, JVP South Florida we're part of a coalition called the South Florida Coalition for Palestine. So I'm also part of an international Jewish collective called the International Jewish Collective for Justice in Palestine. And we are from about 12 organizations, all anti-Zionist Jewish organizations that work in partnership with Palestinian groups in their respective countries. And so we have maybe 12 to 15 countries. We meet monthly, and we've really started organized. We've just found it. We didn't know what would come of it when we started. I think it was at the beginning of the pandemic, and we've all found it really, really meaningful. It's from South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, different parts of Europe, Canada. We've really been, I think our work has gotten strengthened being part of this coalition together. So I guess, and I'm also part of, even though I'm not in New York anymore, I remain part of a group, Jews Say No, which is a smaller group, but we've all been, I guess for most of us, we've been longtime civil rights activists. And so we kind of bring that history to our organizing. Should I just keep sharing a little bit about maybe, okay. So also just in terms of like Palestine and Israel, I'm co-director and part of a center called Parseo, Participatory Action Research Center. And and my co-director is Nina Mehta, who I want to give a shout out to because she's one of the most amazing people to do this work with. And so we do a lot of different things, but one of the things we've started doing more and more are community education and curricula, social justice curricula, that we've been asked to work on and work with. And I'm really, and our center is huge believers in like the power of community education, not as like an add-on to our organizing, but really as integral to it, as central to it. And so we have recently been part of developing 2 curricula. One is with Project 48, run by Nadia Sa, who's a Palestinian educator and strategist, and it's called the Palestinian Nakba curriculum, which we've worked on for quite some time, and you can go to project48.com. And it's a several session, very in-depth curriculum about the history of the Nakba. It's so many visuals and video movies from where you really see Palestinian life prior to and since 1948. And then there's sections on testimonies, the ongoing Nakba, archives. So it's a very comprehensive curricula that was created really for schools and universities and then other community spaces. So that's something that we partnered with Project 48 to create. And again, another shout out to Nadia Sa, whose work is just amazing. And I think I also mention these people because I think so much of this work is about, the relationships we're building and the people we're doing this work with. And like, I just feel right now just so grateful to have that opportunity to be doing this work with such wonderful people. And I also, so the second curriculum is called the Curriculum on Anti-Semitism from a Framework of Collective Liberation. And I mean, I can talk a little bit more about that but I'll just give a little bit of the background first. We were really asked, a number of social justice groups and educators came together, and, there's all this anti-Semitism curricula out there, but it's really problematic politically. It looks at anti-Semitism in isolation. It's just on many levels very problematic. And a lot of people in groups said we would like a curriculum on anti-Semitism, but from a framework of collective liberation. So we actually spent more time on it than we anticipated developing it. We have a beautiful group of advisors and community reviewers from many different communities who were part of going through materials. We did pilots. I mean, we had so many different people, Jewish historians, other historians, like just really like helping us develop it and look at it. And we now have it. We just did a launch. Haymarket did a launch with us. And I think part of that also is it grew out of one, this awareness that we need to understand what anti-Semitism is, especially at a time of rising white nationalism when Jews, along with so many other communities, are being targeted, but also that it's just as important to understand what anti-Semitism is not. And so we spend a lot of time in the curriculum. We go through Jewish histories and different experiences of being Jewish, Jews from different parts of the world, intersecting histories of anti-Semitism, what anti-Semitism historically has looked like in the US, what it looks like today. And then we spend time really talking about what anti-Semitism is not. What does it mean to exceptionalize anti-Semitism? Who has the right to speak about anti-Semitism? And then we really spend time devoted to like what does it mean to really understand anti-Semitism from the framework and from the lens of collective liberation. So that's just recently been launched, and we are going to be, this coming week, we're actually doing some programs with different educators in New York and in the Bay Area, and we're looking forward to doing more of that with like across the country.
This is fantastic work, and I think Christy in the background is looking for the links. And so we'll try to get those and drop them in the chat for everyone. We're also, so you all know, compiling a list of all the resources all of our guests share with us, and we'll share that out at the end of the 2 days. Donna, I wonder, I'm imagining after hearing you talk about this curriculum project, I imagine people our interest in hearing a little bit, if you're comfortable, or if it's possible to summarize what is a large project and a complex set of histories, what is and what is not anti-Semitism. I wonder if that's something that you might help educators think about how to understand, and its relationship to Zionism.
Great, I'm sure. And also the curriculum for anti-Semitism is antisemitismcurriculum.org. Yeah, the nutbookcurriculums.com, I often get them mixed up, but the anti-Semitism is .org. So do you want me just to share a little bit maybe about like what's in the curriculum? So we really open up with talking about, anti-Semitism. It's real, like other forms of injustice. It has distinct characteristics while also connecting and intersecting with other forms of oppression. And we talk about what anti-Semitism is, which we have lots of different examples of sort of different voices sharing what anti-Semitism is. And we kind of put our basic framework that it's, which I have here, generally understood as discrimination against Jews, violence against Jews, or targeting of Jews because they're Jewish, and stereotypes of Jews are also manifestations of anti-Semitism. And we go into talking about how Jews really reflect like ethnically, economically, culturally diverse communities, experiences and histories. And so their experiences of anti-Semitism have differed quite dramatically throughout history. It's not static, it's interrelated to other systems of oppression, and also with what's happening in different societies at different times. And we then we go into that while Jews continue to live without fundamental systemic barriers in the US, in recent years, the rise of white nationalism has impacted Jewish communities. We are also clear that we focus on that, but it also, white nationalism impacts many different communities. So when you look at what happened in Charlottesville, for example, where it said Jews will not replace us, but the underlying purpose of that rally was anti-Black racism and white supremacy. So we also try to show, and we have a section where we talk about how white Jews have benefited from white supremacy, and how all Jews, white Jews and Jews of color, have been victims of white nationalist violence. And we spent some time thinking about that and talking about that. And then we move to, really looking at, and that takes some time. We have a lot of resources. We wanted to do it thoughtfully. And then we move into, again, while it's so important to understand what anti-Semitism is, it's critically important to understand what it's not, and that, as we know, organized campaigns are derailing and misstating the meaning of anti-Semitism and falsely conflating it with criticism of Israel and with criticism of Zionism. And so we have also seen that this tactic that's really been used by opponents of Palestinian justice for years and years and years. I mean, I'm 68. I remember in my 20s those tactics, but it's become very intensified as the movement for justice has grown and grown. Like it's on steroids now. You really you can see it in full force. And we also stress that this, the misstating and distortion of what anti-Semitism is, it furthers political goals that are harmful to all our work for justice, including that of fighting anti-Semitism. And then we talk about the different ways this is played out with the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which has examples that conflate anti-Semitism with criticism of Israel. We see how this is being pushed for in different, spheres of government, universities, and how it's all designed to silence critics of Israel's human rights abuses, to silence critics of Zionism. And then we spend a little time talking about data and the use and misuse of data, because when an organization like, for example, the Anti-Defamation League falsely considers criticism of Israel as anti-Semitism, and their accounting of what anti-Semitism is, obviously the data is all skewed and inaccurate. So we really talk about how important it is to kind of look at where your sources are coming from. And just as another group I'm part of, which is a coalition, is called Drop the ADL. I think that's droptheadl.org, if I'm not mistaken. And we have we've created like a primer that talks about the damage and the harm that the Anti-Defamation League has done historically to this day to those fighting for Palestinian justice, but also to communities of color, to Muslim communities, to so many different communities. And we had a letter that's been signed so far by, I think it's a few hundred social justice organizations now who are pledging not to work with the ADL. And we really want to continue building that. And we see just in the past weeks, the damage the ADL continues to do. I mean, actually, if possible, it seems like they're even getting worse. So I guess then from there, we really talk about who has the right. We challenge this notion of who has the right to speak about anti-Semitism. And while we honor this notion that, of course, those most impacted by an injustice should be in the forefront of talking about it, but we say there's something very pernicious going on here, because a lot of the attacks about anti-Semitism are false attacks of anti-Semitism. And also, so we believe it's very important for everyone to have that right. We've also, throughout the curriculum, have created roundtable conversations and interviews with Palestinian leaders, Black activists, people from different communities who talk about kind of looking at anti-Semitism from a framework of collective liberation. And we have a Palestinian human rights lawyer who really addresses this issue of who has the right to speak about anti-Semitism. So throughout the curriculum, we've included, and also part of that is we were thinking of not just colleges, because we have a lot of text, but we wanted to have a number of videos. And so we created many of them with some wonderful activists and educators throughout. And then we really moved to looking at what it means to challenge anti-Semitism from a framework of collective liberation. And we give lots of examples of different social movements and how they've organized, and kind of the issues from abolition to disability justice to others, about really looking at kind of how this work can be, how we can further this work for justice in a really meaningful way. So kind of that's the curriculum that we've developed. Yeah.
It's incredible work. And I just sent you through the Zoom chat the link to the Palestinian Nakba curriculum to make sure we're sharing the correct one.
Because there used to be a basic, yes, Project 40. Let me just make sure that, yeah, I'm sure that's it. It should be just project48.com, but I think this is curriculum. That's it. Yeah, that's definitely
okay, great. So Christy, if you're able to drop in the chat, fantastic. Thank you so much. You and I emailed a little bit, and I shared that on Friday. Dylan Rodriguez said, one of the things that many of us need to do is a deeper study of Zionism, sort of where it came from, how it works, how it gets entangled in these imperialist, colonial, genocidal frameworks. And so I wonder, and we've heard people say, Zionism is anti-Semitic. There are these sort of different framings, and I wonder if you would help us think for a minute about the formation, role, function of Zionism and its relation to these other forms and movements that are kind of circulating as people are trying to struggle themselves or in solidarity.
One thing just to say, in the Nakba curriculum, we have an entire section. One of our sections is on Zionism, and really shows, one of the things we really wanted to show too was intentionality. And also, it's really important for me to say that anti-Zionism, while it stands against Zionism as a settler colonial ideology, it stands for justice. Anti-Zionism is an ideology that is deeply committed to justice and liberation for people, for Palestinian people, but it's also, that's the ideology that is really, so it's not just against Zionism, but it's really a very liberatory framework. And I think that's really important to say, because, one of the things we know is that, and I think this is important, is that there is no connection between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. It's absolutely no connection. And when sometimes people will say, well, this anti-Zionist said something anti-Semitic. Well, people can call themselves anything. I've been with people who call themselves socialists and Marxists who say really messed up stuff. And so, yes, any individual can say something, but the ideology of anti-Zionism it's the antithesis of anti-Semitism because it's committed to challenging all forms of injustice, and that includes anti-Semitism. And the movement for justice in Palestine has been exquisitely sensitive about that and has put that out at every form. So anyone who wants to mistake anti-Zionism for anti-Semitism, who's putting that out there, I really do not trust their agenda. I mean, I don't mean that people who have genuine questions, because there are people who are confused and conflicted, and that's part of the work I'm committed to doing. But I'm talking about that movement to conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism has an agenda, and it's not really about fighting anti-Semitism, because it's about fighting liberation for Palestinian liberation. So I do think one of the reasons we put a whole section on Zionism in the curricula is that we think it's very important to understand the origins, the history, and the fact that the Nakba, the expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians from their land and their home, is the consequence of Zionism. That's what is Zionism. You can't separate one from the other. So yeah, I think, all of us learning more together about this. I mean, just going back to my deep commitment to community education, it's not for I love learning, but it's also because I think it deepens and sharpens our work for justice in very significant ways, or at least I can say it has done that for me, because I had originally, when I was younger, I had started from 1967. I was against the occupation. I didn't know about the Nakba. It's not that the information wasn't out there, but growing up in Jewish spaces, I didn't learn it. And it wasn't until I began my organizing and work with Palestinians where I started hearing about the Nakba and what had happened. And then many of us came together to learn more. So I do feel like if you talk about the right of return for Palestinians, the support for boycott, divestment, sanctions, all of the things that we support, it goes back to understanding about the Nakba and Zionism as a settler colonialist movement. If that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I want to pull a question that we got in the chat that I think connects to another thing we emailed about, which is, the way in which anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are being cast, narrated as distinct, particularly in schooling, maybe not particularly, but for people on our call, I think educational spaces are a particular context. And we're seeing legislation, we're seeing policy that's sort of, bifurcating these as if they're oppositional when, they share an origin and a weaponized purpose. And I wonder if you might help us think about that in your work and connected to this question of, are there actionable ways to address accusations of anti-Semitism when calling out or pointing to Zionist violence?
All right, there's a lot of questions in the question, so let me see if I can. I do want to say first, in terms of, because I spent a lot of time doing work around Islamophobia, and I've learned so much from the number of people I've worked with from Muslim communities and Muslim organizations who have done such powerful work, and particularly looking at state-sanctioned Islamophobia. And in fact, you mentioned Jews Against Anti-Muslim Racism, and our website, all the information on it is from Muslim activists and scholars and educators. And so I just want to say that there are groups that really have looked at this very deeply and have really understood the relationship between the quote war on terror, structural Islamophobia, and that's so important. I think, and something else I want to say sort of related is that one of the things that's really hard to stomach is that some of these Jewish organizations that actually support state-sanctioned Islamophobia come out with these statements. If there's some kind of something that happens, they'll be like, we're really opposed to Islamophobia, when in fact their organizations are fomenting it. Because Zionism is right. It's, in addition to a lot of things, it's also rooted in anti-Muslim racism, along with many other things. And so I think for those of us who are committed to justice in that really deep, holistic way, that like we need to dismantle and kind of not allow that narrative to come forth, which is why when these organizations speak out, many of us from our different communities say, this is disingenuous. In fact, it's important to point out how these organizations claiming to speak against Islamophobia are in fact fomenting it. Many of our groups from Muslim communities, Jewish communities, other communities really are careful about who we will partner with for good reason. I mean, while all of us are very into, I think at this moment for so because it's so important for building the broadest coalitions we can, like I think that's so important right now. I think it also, is important to be like thoughtful about not working with these organizations that are fomenting and perpetuating sort of the Zionist narrative that is actually rooted in all of these in negative things and enable to say, oh, well, we can march together for this or something like that. So I don't know if I really answered your question, but I think that there are, it's worth really being able to like, again, kind of thoughtfully think about how do we frame this in a way that's not in some way feeding into or perpetuating some of the ways that Islamophobia in fact gets perpetuated by like kind of making kosher these other kinds of things.
No, absolutely. And it's making me think about your description of I'm not sure if I got this correct, but these sort of an international Jewish collective for justice in Palestine, these partnerships across diasporas. You said somewhere between 12 and 15 countries, you have maybe chapters. And I'm understanding that you're communicating across those chapters to understand sort of the different contexts and struggles and fights. And I wonder if there's something in that model that might help people think about, how to navigate different organizations and coalitions. Like, is there something you're learning or have learned from that global model of local struggle?
Well, it's so interesting because I've learned so much. When we first got together, some of us kind of thought, let's have a phone call, because it was especially when the IHRA definition first came out or it was getting more prominence. And we were like, let's see what other groups are doing. Many of us had different contacts. We came together and like, it was amazing. It was just, and there's groups who have, Ireland and South Africa are very different from the US and Canada. New Zealand is a whole different, and Germany right now with what's happening in Germany. And I think what's happened, and we're actually going to meet in person for the first time in June in London, everybody's sort of pooling their resources so that everyone can come. And I think it's that one is that as recognizing our different locations and situations, we've also been able to like offer support for one another. So when issues have come up, we not only, sort of discuss the local context, but we also are able to then broaden it to our global context. And many times we've been asked to write letters from all our organizations to send when a particular issue is happening. So I would say in terms of, why, because I love this group and I don't ever want to miss the monthly meetings, even though sometimes they're very inconvenient time-wise because we have to work it around everybody's schedule. But I'm always, because also these are all groups so rooted in racial justice work and in Palestine liberation work, hearing about different local contexts and kind of challenging ourselves and deepening our own work, I found it very valuable. It's just something that's we're learning. I walk away I don't walk away, I'm on a Zoom call. I leave each Zoom meeting just feeling like I've got new ways of thinking and of sort of challenging how we're doing things. And there's only a few. We make sure there's not too many from the US. We don't want it to be US dominant, which is very easy to happen. And so we really also make sure that we have Latin America, also like just the different spaces and locations that we can always be learning from and with each other. Yeah, I find it, very, very valuable. I did want to mention though, just one thing, because I think we have to end it in a minute. But because, you know, as some may know, there have been these large actions that Jewish Voice for Peace and others have done. So just 2 hours ago, my friends FaceTimed me from the Statue of Liberty, where they all were there taking over, having ceasefire now, never again means now, and not in our name. And there were hundreds and hundreds of people. And like, I have to say, when I saw it, when I got the FaceTime call, it was actually moving. And if anything, you know, these mainstream Jewish organizations can say until they're whatever, that the Jewish community is with them. Like, I don't think there's any way right now that they could make that claim with a serious face, because clearly it's the tide is changing, fortunately.
Yeah, thank you for that. I saw that on Instagram, and I think I appreciate the reminder to sort of be in direct action in whatever ways we can within communities and across communities. Our first speaker, Sharif Sagaut, couldn't join us because he's with Arab Resource and Organizing Center in the Bay, and they, you know, undertook the Block the Boat actions on Friday for, I think it was maybe 9 hours, and then that ship went to Port of Tacoma. They're there since I think 5 o'clock this morning, maybe. You know, and people are using their bodies in their cars and using, if they can't do that, using social media, using whatever, you know, we all can do different things. So I really appreciate your bringing that direct action back in. And I think people feel disheartened because the massacre, the sort of, I said earlier, I'm not sure we even have language for this sort of accelerated genocide that we're witnessing. It feels both empowering to take direct action of multiple sorts, and also just a sort of horrifying sense of grief and responsibility. And I wonder if you might close with helping educators think about you know, how to move through that with students, to think about the risks involved, and the sort of navigating this urgent call to all of us right now. It's an urgent call to risk in a variety of ways.
Yeah, I mean, it is an unbearable, it's an unbearable moment. And, you know, it's hard not to wake up in the morning and just think, like, you know, what can I do? Like, what, like, we're all trying to do, you know, and there's so much powerful organizing going on. I mean, incredible among so many communities, and just in every different way. And yet then we know what the machine is, you know, what's going on and how it's happening. And I think, I guess, and maybe what I feel is, like, at this point, you know, what we have is just continuing to build together. I mean, I feel like nothing's more important than our communities right now. I mean, I feel like the relationships that many of us have from all across the globe, like, we're with each other now. Like, we're, you know, however we can, supporting each other, and those who are particularly directly impacted in so many ways by families just not knowing what's happening to their families, or knowing their families are dying. And I just feel like the more we can, and one of the things that we talk about when even educators bring this curriculum into the classroom too, is how to support educators as they're up against, whether it's administrations or their school districts or whatever it is, but just to keep, like, almost to forefront as much as we can that building of community that we can do. And also, the one thing I do want to say is about, not everybody has to do everything. And there's different ways of doing it. I mean, I struggle with this. I'm claustrophobic and I can no longer get arrested. I can't at this point in my life. And so I try to do many, many other things that I can do that I think are meaningful. And a lot of times people will come to me and say, you know, certain people can take the risk of getting arrested. Others absolutely can't. And I think we also have to be generous with one another in our movements to, like, really to know that there's so many ways, you know, there's just not one way to be the activist. And, you know, this is about all of our humanities and building, like, justice. And so I guess I don't have a great answer, because we do wake up every morning and it's the most horrifying, it is hard to get up, but we need to, and we have to, and we do, and we need each other. I guess without, that's how I've been sort of, both myself, but also when I'm talking to lots of new people who are getting involved. I also just don't want people to feel that like there's one right way to do it, because there's not. There's really not. And we also, for those of us who've been doing it for a long time, like, it's really good for us to shut up sometimes too, and to know there's a lot of people, even if they've been involved for a week, they've got so much, you know what I mean? It's like, it tends to be a little bit of like, we're the experts, and like, no, that's not the case.
But we do really appreciate the knowledge, the deep knowledge that comes from your experience, and that, you're willing to share that with us very honestly. And I know we all learned a lot in our short conversation with you. So I thank you so much for talking with us, for thinking with us, for sharing your time, so people can learn from your decades of work. Really grateful, Donna.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I'm also really was appreciative to be part of what I know is a wonderful, what you're doing. And so thank you. And I've heard wonderful things about you from one of my dearest friends. So
maybe a mutual, maybe Uju.
Yes.
Yes.
Uju, who's one of my favorite people, but
Yeah.
she raves about you. So yeah, thank you so much.
Phenomenal. Thank you, Uju, if you're here. Thank you, Donna.
Bye-bye.
Bye. So if you're just joining us or you're staying with us, welcome back. This is day 2 of the series of short conversations with people whose knowledge, whose experience will support your teaching and your organizing in the struggle for a free Palestine and the right of return, and against the ongoing U.S.-Israeli colonization, occupation, settlement, and genocide that are a century in the making. Please come and go over the course of these next 2 conversations as you wish. I am Sabina Vaught, and I'm really honored to be welcoming Dr. Jennifer Kelly. Jennifer, I think you're with us. Hello. Dr. Kelly is Associate Professor in the Department of Feminist Studies at the University of California at Santa Cruz, where she's also affiliated with the Center for the Middle East and North Africa. Among a number of other courses, she teaches comparative settler colonial studies and militarism and tourism. Dr. Kelly is the author of Invited to Witness Solidarity Tourism Across Occupied Palestine, a new book, which I'm going to get and read. With co-editors Samdeep Sen and Leela Sharif, Dr. Kelly's current project is entitled Detours, a Decolonial Guide to Palestine. This is an edited volume that considers how Palestinians in Palestine and in the diaspora assert their connections to their homeland, often via initiatives that resemble tourism. So there's a much longer bio. We're trying to be quick and make space to hear from you as much as we can. So we welcome you, Dr. Kelly, and we thank you so very much for sharing your time with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so appreciative of what you're doing, especially in terms of, we've been talking a lot at Santa Cruz about how to make space in the classroom, to pause business as usual, and to insist on equipping educators with knowledge about how to intervene in this horrific genocide that we're witnessing. So I think you all are doing the work of providing those resources to people, and I'm really appreciative of it.
It's the least we can do. Oh, I want to start off by sharing that you write that you, quote, analyze the complex ways in which solidarity tourism has emerged in Palestine as an organizing strategy that is both embedded in and working against histories of sustained displacement. And I'm wondering if you can just explain to organizers in particular on the call, educators too, what was this practice of solidarity tourism? I think we just love to learn what you're describing.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. So my book is on solidarity tourism across occupied Palestine. So it analyzes the practice, the phenomenon since the first Intifada of bringing international tourists to Palestine to witness the effects of Israeli state violence and to work toward Palestinian liberation. And I talk a lot in the book. I kind of trace the history of how solidarity tourism became professionalized in the wake of the Oslo Accords, how it moved from a more clandestine, less institutionalized form of delegations and tourists coming to Palestine, but also what has stayed the same. So I trace what is different and also what has stayed the same. And one of the things that is really, I think, crucial for our conversations now is that so much of solidarity tourism is predicated on the notion that tourists need to see it to believe it. And so the idea that tourists need to come to Palestine to witness, right, that they're invited to come to Palestine to witness. One thing that is really central in the book is asking why that is, right, and talking about how the phenomenon of solidarity tourism exists as a practice because Palestinians are not treated as reliable narrators of their own condition, which requires internationals to come to Palestine. It requires international presence to corroborate Palestinian narratives and analyses of Israeli occupation. And these are narratives and analyses that have long been in the historical record. Like, this is a practice of accumulating evidence when evidence already abounds. And it's a phenomenon that insists that we ask why the accumulation of evidence of Israeli state violence continues to be the ask when that evidence is so ubiquitous, right? And so much about it is about why and how tourists are asked to corroborate Palestinian narratives of their own displacement. And that is a underpinning of solidarity tourism as a phenomenon. And then the other part of that is that Palestinian tour guides are constantly both pointing that out and intervening in tourist expectations for what they're witnessing in Palestine. So I think tourists come to Palestine with a host of expectations. One is that they may come to Palestine to sort of volunteer or stay for long amounts of time, and they're consistently met with the response that your work is not here. So, like, welcome to Palestine, your work is not here. So come, learn, spend 10 days here, 7 to 10 days here, 2 hours, whatever you have, and please go home and do your work there. So I think that is one sort of expectation that gets turned on its head on the part of tourists in Palestine. And the other is that tourists in Palestine often carry with them expectations that they're going to be kind of met with Palestinians performing their subjection for tourists, and Palestinians intervene in that as a practice too, right? So intervene in that kind of like desire for evidence, desire for Palestinian tour guides and hosts displaying their wounds for tourists and having tourists sort of consume that. And so I think what is especially important to like take from that now is that we, of course, are witnessing a genocide like live streamed on Instagram, right? And every day Israel is murdering more Palestinians. Every day we see more of this carnage. And we know, of course, the US is funding it. We know, of course, that the weapons are manufactured in the US. And still, while we are witnessing this, Palestinians are still not treated as reliable narrators, right? They're still accused of bombing their own hospitals. They're still accused of fabricating the numbers of their dead, right? And so the practice, the underpinning of solidarity tourism, the need to see it to believe it, this accumulation of evidence when evidence already abounds, all speaks to this very real underlying sort of thing that dictates how everything we're witnessing is perceived, which is where Palestinians are not treated as reliable narrators and not treated as capable of theorizing their own conditions. And so I think, for me at least, one of the asks as educators is to understand what not only what we're witnessing, right, but to be able to describe what we're witnessing to students and describe how what we're witnessing is obfuscated through this lens of treating Palestinians as though they're not reliable narrators and need corroboration from non-Palestinians. And so for me and for my students, and what I sort of take from that and give to them is a grounding in Palestinian studies and an insistence that witnessing does not supplant study, and witnessing does not supplant research, and the sort of grounding that Palestinian studies like offers in these horrific moments is where students need to go, right? What the kind of study that students are asked to do on top of all of the sort of organizing to end the genocide that we're witnessing.
Thank you for that. You're brilliant. I mean, that was amazing. The sort of nutshell way you did pulled all of that together, and I was taking notes and trying to process. And I guess I have two, immediate questions, but there may be other directions you want to go. So please, like, ignore my questions if you want to take us in another direction. But two things that kind of came up as you were talking about sort of Palestinian people not being understood as legitimate narrators over a century. I mean, this is, as you said, there's this immediate thing happening, but this is a long process. But also, what does that mean for Palestinian people across diaspora? What does that mean for narration in relation to, right of return, to sort of occupation, to decolonization? How is that narration or its function playing out globally? And then, another question I had is, how is this sort of related to, or not, maybe this larger, it's not larger, this other practice that, Teresa Tewa called militarism. There were a couple study groups over the last many months where some of the people on this call studied that. And sort of, is there a larger question or a sort of set of liberatory frameworks you might help people think through in terms of relating in solidarity? That's a whole lot. And again, you could pick or
no, I love those questions. I think I'm going to start with the second one because I think it relates to how, like, a lot of us who have been doing the sort of teach-ins hosted in critical race and ethnic studies at UC Santa Cruz have been trying to make that a space for example, faculty who aren't sure how to bring this into the classroom and want guidance, especially for TAs, teaching assistants, who want to do this work in their sections, but are doing so without the support of their professors, for K through 12 educators, for anyone who needs some guidance around how to do this work and how to make space for it in the classroom. And I think the question around militarism helps answer that as well, because one of the students we spoke to was like, I'm teaching a TV studies class, and like, of course, this has everything to do with TV studies and representational practice and media representations, and how we understand what we're viewing, like how we do what we're taught to do otherwise, right? Like, critically analyze the racialized and gendered formations of media representations, right? And the militarism is, and this was advice that I got from my one of my advisors, Naomi Paik, early on in the dissertation writing, was like, you want to bring Palestine, figure out a way to bring Palestine to people who are interested in tourism, but not necessarily have any sort of knowledge base around Palestine, or interested in militarism but don't know a lot about Palestine, and how to like stage these conversations as a way in to be able to make space for talking about the Nakba, for talking about over 75 years of displacement, right? For talking about contemporary state violence, talking about settler, but like all of these things, and finding a way to bring them into the classroom. And I think the question of militarism, it allows you to do that, because there's so much in the sort of study of that phenomenon. And I'm sure in reading her work, you spoke a lot about Hawaii, right? And so like there are so like the study of militarism in Hawaii was so formative for my understanding of how tourism functioned under military occupation in Palestine, even though the way that tourism is packaged in each site looks very different, right? And so from everything from kind of like what is often considered like an obfuscation of militarism in tours to Israel, like birthright, which I find much less an obfuscation than a celebration, right? Because like IDF soldiers are leading tours, they're imbricated in the fabric of birthright. So it's something where like the militarism is actually on stark display and celebrated. And I think that's true. And I think that's what you know, the kinds of like detours in Hawaii have underscored that too. Like, what do we do when militarism is not only obfuscated but also celebrated, and also both disappeared and also takes up so much space, right? And so I think that those are ways in for students too, to do like comparative studies together about how tourism functions in Palestine and how tourism functions in Hawaii, and how we can think about militarism, and how we can think about what happens in these what we assume happens on these kinds of tours and what actually happens, right? So from everything from like the obfuscation of militarism to the kind of assumption that solidarity tourism in Palestine is just occupation tourism, or is just kind of occupation like voyeurism, which to me, like I've worked against that dismissal since the beginning, because it dismisses the labor of Palestinian tour guides who do this work every day and who show up every day and do all this extensive research and extensive study to lay out for tourists what they're witnessing, in spite of the sort of violence of that the violence of the site of knowledge production in that interaction, despite the fraught terrain of tourism, despite the fact that tourists come expecting to see this sort of a tour of suffering, and tour guides providing that evidence, but also intervening in the ask for that evidence, right? So I think this kind of like dismissal around the forms and shapes that we think we understand about tourism and militarism, and an actual like really deep study of these practices allows students a way in when they might understand something about Hawaii, but they might not know anything about Palestine, or vice versa. And I think the other thing that's important here is I've had way too many people in the past 30 days and before suggest somehow that nuance is that nuance is synonymous with like both sides, or some kind of like normalization narrative, and the subtext of that is that you cannot have anti-Zionist, anti-colonial critique with nuance, right? And so I think that tourism is one of the sites that tells us, like, how do you have a deeply anti-Zionist study, a deeply anti-colonial study that also details the nuance of anti-colonial movement work, right? And doesn't allow nuance to just be like the province of people who are too fearful to actually name and identify what we're witnessing.
There are a number of things there, but one thing I wanted to reiterate for educators is something you said in your first remarks and then emphasized again, which is there are ways, as I heard you, correct me if I'm wrong, rather than perhaps if a TA wants to bring the considerations and questions of Palestine to a class, that one sort of pedagogical and curricular strategy for that is to bring it through the topic or the disciplinary area. So through tourism, through TV, through whatever the disciplinary or field-based area might be. And I thought that was such a important point to reiterate, that there are routes of access or points of entry that will help people engage in conversation, and people who are teaching from perhaps more vulnerable positions.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that also goes up against the kind of I think we're seeing some of this, and I think we'll see more, is like a flurry of administrators wanting to suggest that you can't change your syllabus right in the middle of a course. That is, I think, a response to Palestine showing up in the classroom and wanting to make sure that that's silenced, right? And so one way of thinking about this is demanding the relevance of Palestine in almost everything we teach, right? And demanding that this is not a departure, one, that we have, that it's absolutely in our right as educators to pause business as usual, to make space in our class for students to like comprehend this catastrophic world that they're trying to make sense of, right? And two, that there is a relevance, there's an argument about relevance to be made in almost every course that we teach, and that part of our task as educators is guiding our students through being able to do that kind of analysis and make those kind of comparative, do that kind of comparative study and ground their work in study. And so I think it's really necessary for that reason. And then another reason is the kind of, I think there, as we know, like one of the most frequently used arguments to shut down conversation on Palestine is to say it's too complicated, right? And to sort of reproduce a lot of the what masquerades as like disciplinary gatekeeping, but which is actually just a way to keep Palestine out of classrooms. And I think that identifying that for what it is one part of this, and the other part is insisting that educators don't need to know everything that's ever happened in Palestine to be able to talk to their students about how to navigate the information they're receiving, right, and critically analyze it and deconstruct the misinformation campaigns that they're confronted with every time they consume any kind of media, and understanding that teaching them how to do that and teaching them about a genocide that they're living through and witnessing is crucial work, right? And that is not work that need only fall on people who are experts, right, or see themselves as experts of long histories of Palestine.
Yeah, I appreciate that framing for educators. I wonder if we could shift a tiny bit. On Friday, Nadine Neber, charged us to understand Palestinian liberation as a queer issue. And this morning, Neda Elia talked about pinkwashing. And I know you've published and written on pinkwashing in relation to Palestine and to solidarity tourism. And I wonder if you could kind of anchor us there, not just as sort of a description of what it is, but also as, ways to actively resist, to sort of join in struggle against that.
Absolutely. And I think so. The piece, one of the things that I wrote about pinkwashing was exactly what I was talking about earlier, in terms of the way that like pinkwashing is sometimes understood as solely obfuscation, right? And solely a sort of celebration of queer freedoms in Israel, as a way to like paper over Israeli human rights violations and Israeli state violence. But one of the things I write about in that piece is actually as I look at LGBT birthright initiatives and how LGBT birthright initiatives are not divorced from Israeli state violence and militarism, in the sense that they are led by soldiers, right? That soldiers are tour guides, and that Israeli militarism is celebrated on LGBT birthright. That Israeli narratives of defense are circulated in these programs, right? And that those programs are part and parcel of larger Zionist state narratives. So I think that that understanding like what is at work in LGBT birthright, and also other kinds of forms of tourism that traffic in all of these like pinkwashing tropes, like what is actually at work on those tours and in those ad campaigns and in those programs, because what is at work is, as so many scholars of pinkwashing have shown, right, what is at work is it's really the justificatory logic for Israeli state violence and displacement. So it's using these narratives that really hinge on like a lot of the tourist narratives really hinge on like queer freedom of mobility. So it's like you can go here and you can go here and you can do this and you can hold your hands in public and you can like all of these things that are sort of circulating this idea of Israel as like a queer haven. And I think that so much queer Palestinian organizing has said, has of course has named that, has identified that, has resisted that, has theorized that, and how those tours function and what they obscure and also what they reveal and celebrate. And I think one of the most important things was when there was a homo nationalism and pinkwashing conference, I think in 2011, and one of the queer Palestinian organizers, Haneen Mikey, said, you know, are you in solidarity with queer Palestinians or are you in solidarity with Palestine, right? And so I think, and this is one of the things that I talk about with tour guide interlocutors all the time, is this idea of one, and Mohammed Al-Kurt has talked about this a lot recently, like the perfect victim, right? And the other is this idea of sameness and sort of wanting to identify, like thinking about, and I think that this is what I think about when I think about solidarity tourism a lot, is like what is the strategy and what gets lost in the strategy and what are the stakes of the strategy. And so you can think about this with like Christian Zionist, like the ubiquity of Christian Zionism, and then Christian anti-Zionist tourism to Palestine, or Christian anti-Zionist work, which is so crucial for combating Christian Zionism, but cannot do so under any sort of exceptionalization of Christian Palestinians, right? And so I think that these kinds of questions are necessary as people do this work, do the solidarity work, interrogate the solidarity work they're doing, and think about the kinds of stakes and claims of their strategies as they're sort of responding to state violence, and think about what those stakes are and what they traffic in and what they might obscure themselves.
So I just want to repeat for people your first three questions, because I think this is helpful for organizing and for teaching. So what is the strategy? What gets lost in the strategy? What are the stakes of the strategy? Did I get those right? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think those are questions we can ask ourselves in our pedagogy, in our curriculum. So what's the strategy? What gets lost? And what are the stakes? Such an important framing. I want to give people a chance to drop questions in the chat if they have any. I also want to give you a chance to go in a direction that I haven't identified. So things that you think we should be thinking about, or that you want to share with educators and organizers.
Yeah, I think that, so when I've been talking to, doing this kind of like teaching work, talking to other educators, and I think one thing that's really important for students, at least for my students, like what I start all my classes with, is the question of political education, and is the importance of not disaggregating study from struggle. And so I always share with them Rachel Herzing's articulation of study and struggle in the wake of George Floyd's murder, right, where she said that this distinction between study and struggle misses the point, and that the purpose of political education is to strengthen our movement work, right? And so I think that I'm kind of like, for me, I'm kind of always trying to like anchor these conversations in Palestinian studies, because so much of the book is like the way that tourists and delegates can use witnessing as an alibi for research, or do witness instead of doing research. And to me, it's such an important thing to return to the research. And it's not a sort of distancing abstraction from the work, the movement work itself. It's actually like a very grounding and important decision to make. So I think understanding that the connection and necessity of study and struggle together is one thing. That's sort of like, we cannot abandon a study. This is not a moment to abandon study, right? And so I share with my students, much like Donna was talking about earlier, the Nakba curriculum. I share with my students a Palestinian studies reading list. I point them to Palestine in Praxis, the Scholars for Palestinian Freedom's public letter in the wake of the last bombing campaign in Gaza, which was a demand to meaningfully engage Palestine in our classroom, not as a case study not only as a case study among others, but actually to like do deep study in our classrooms, research, and institutions, right? And so I think that is a sort of anchor for me that I share with students in these moments. And then I can share all of the resources. The other things that I would share too are, the ADL is sending pamphlets home with K through 12 students, and that of course conflate Zionism with conflate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, and see any critique of Israel as anti-Semitic. And so some of my friends and colleagues have organized a Gaza for Parents and Educators toolkit, which is anti-racist and anti-colonial, and is a Q&A and links to Palestinian and Jewish voices, and uses sort of age-appropriate language. So that's one resource I've been sharing. And then another is How to Talk to Your Kids About Palestine, which is for like even littler. My baby's a 2-year-old, so thinking about like how to do this pedagogically in the classroom, but also with our babies, also for my students, nieces and nephews. So I have those resources I can share as well. And then I can look in the chat for questions.
Yeah, and I'm looking to, yes, if you're able to share resources when you're done talking, you don't have to multitask. That'd be great. And we'll add them to a list we have of resources people shared. I do think a question came in asking about, the ethics maybe of sharing images in education and in generating resistance to Israel's genocidal violence. Media images seem important but insufficient. That said, aren't images, and I'm imagining these are images, for instance, from Palestinian journalists in Gaza, aren't they more powerful than numbers, or I think sort of information? And so I guess your help in thinking with educators about what it means to look at images of genocide in real time, and particularly when many people in Gaza are asking everyone to repost. Like, what are the tensions or struggles there for you, or how do you think about that with educators?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is a really important question. I think that one way to sort of do this for students that I've been sharing with them is one, like, lists of journalists in Gaza to follow, right? To share with them to one, talk a lot about the many multifaceted ways that Israel is, from everything from cutting off electricity to murdering Palestinian journalists, is trying to make sure that these images and these stories and these narratives are not shared, right? I think in terms of the space of the classroom, so I give them sort of resources to follow, to be able to do that research. I give them ways and avenues aside from just sort of the Palestinian studies reading list, but also in this moment, who and how to have access to that information. And also I am essentially, like, constantly telling them to look to independent media, so to look to Democracy Now! For coverage of the sort of rarity of having Palestinians talk about Palestine, right? As opposed to the sort of ubiquity of journalists speaking for, or reporters speaking for, Palestine. And so in the space of the classroom, what I've found pedagogically invaluable is to share with them things like Rafik Sayada's "We Teach Life, Sir," right, which is a poem from 2011. I can put it in the chat as well. And so when I share this with students, I talk about, it's a poem about the sort of media demand for sound bites and the media demand for, like, human stories that are apolitical, and the ask that is constantly, like, foisted upon Palestinians to do the work of coming up with the perfect soundbite, the perfect image, the perfect story, the perfect human story, that isn't tied to politics. And I think that she does that so beautifully in that poem, that I share that with students. And when I've been sharing that with students, I've also been sharing with them videos from Palestinian journalists in this moment. For example, like with kids playing, right? And a big part of my chapter on Gaza is about how Banksy did this installation piece that was meant to sort of make a mockery of tourism in Gaza. And the Palestinian Gaza parkour team responded with a video of their own, being like, "We would love to host tourists, and if we could, this is what we would show them." And it sort of turned that sort of mockery on its head. And part of that was also foregrounding, like, play, and foregrounding, like, Palestinian joy against this, like, murderous machinery of airstrikes and violence. And I think for me, that is pedagogically necessary in my classroom, also because I don't assume that my student, I don't know who I mean, sometimes I'm teaching big lectures, I'm doing a lot of guest lecturing in other people's classes. I don't know who the students are, and I'm not going to assume that there are not Palestinian students in those classes. And so for me to do that work pedagogically, I think it's important to emphasize the steadfastness of teaching life, of what she calls teaching life, right? The cultivation of Palestinian joy, the insistence on care. And one of the things that I just came from the American Studies Association conference in Montreal, and so many of us in Palestinian studies were talking across our work in this moment and talking about the kind of ubiquity, and several scholars have made this argument around the circulation of women and children as like Maya Mikdashi wrote about this, and Jadalia, Mohammed Al-Kurd's recent talk was on this, but the ubiquity of the women and children as the kind of the real victims of Israeli state violence, which ignores Palestinian men, of course, or treats them as already suspect. And so one of the things that I've been sharing with students too is just so many of these images are fathers carrying their babies, right? And pulling, like, protect, like doing everything that they can to protect their babies. And so I think that this is a moment where it is incumbent upon us as editors to show the pedagogy of life in Gaza right now. And I think that that is another moment of where evidence abounds, and it's just about pulling that evidence for our students and allowing them to see that. And that's especially important for me for any Palestinian students in the classroom who every time they open their phone are seeing a genocide live streamed, to be able to introduce their peers not only to accuracy around what's actually happening, but also to this long practice of teaching life in Palestine.
I'm so grateful that you brought us here. I was in another conversation where we were talking about not only fathers, but men who don't know the babies, who don't know the children, who are expressing care that is it is clearly, for lack of a better word, skilled, right? That communicates something about ongoing practice and values and principles. So I appreciate that you brought us back to that even in the horror, the paying attention to the living, the life, and to be observing and learning all the time. And I think on that note, I've kept you here past our agreed time, and I'm so grateful and feel like we could talk to you forever. And I know my dear friend and colleague, Lisa Ortiz, who's on the call and who said, you should invite this person, will be really sad to see you go. But I want to thank you and appreciate the time and energy you gave to us, the sort of deep commitment of your life's work, and hope that you and your loved ones are okay in this time.
Thank you so much. And also for just anyone on the call, I'm happy to be a resource for whatever you need. In terms of doing this in the class, I'm also a founding collective member of the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. So in terms of thinking, like you were on the last call, about the deep study of Zionism, like any kind of things you need, resources you need, sources you need, anything for the classroom, please just feel free to reach out. I'll put my email in the chat as well. Thank you so much for inviting me and facilitating these conversations.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, we will take a 5-minute break. And so our 6 minutes, and in 6 minutes, we will be on with our final guest over the 2 days, Dr. Niall Fort. So we'll be back in 6 minutes. It should be 4:35 Eastern time. Hey, welcome back to folks who've been with us to this day 2 of this series of short conversations with people whose knowledge and experience will support your teaching and organizing in the struggle for a free Palestine and the right of return, and against the ongoing U.S.-Israeli colonization, occupation, settlement, and genocide that is a century in the making. This is our final conversation of a 2-day series of discussions, so we thank you all for joining us. As we close out Special thank yous to Elon Dancy and Christy McGuire of the Center for Urban Education for collaborating to create the event, to Nakia Washington Butler, Fiona Seals, Kelly Runco, and Caitlin Zerker for tech support. To my dear friends and colleagues, Uju Agrawal and Lisa Ortiz, for helping generously in the shaping of these conversations, and to everyone who helped circulate this event widely. We had 250 people registered this morning before we hopped on for today's first speaker. So you all are amazing. We're just really grateful that you've been with us today. I am Sabina Vaught, and I am honored to be welcoming Dr. Niall Fort, a minister, activist, and scholar who studies how people resist oppression, build beloved community, and struggle to transform the world. He is assistant professor of African American and African diaspora studies at Columbia University. Niall's two current book projects, Spirit of Struggle and Amazing Grief, meditate on the work of spirit and mourning in Black and multiracial freedom movements. His writing is featured in The Guardian, The Boston Globe, The New York Magazine, Socialism and Democracy, Harvard Journal of African American Public Policy, and There's a Revolution Outside. I love Letters from a Crisis. Dr. Ford, thank you for being with us today in the midst of what I'm observing on social media is a really urgent and busy time for you on the ground with your organizing.
Thank you. Well, thank you first for having me, and thank you all who were instrumental in making this happen. I'm very happy to be here and be invited, and very happy to be a student of many of the people that you all invited to share. And just want to start by saying I still have so much to learn. So I take myself to be more of a student than a scholar of social movements and what's happening in Palestine and in Gaza. So yeah, I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
I have questions for you, but I also want to just start by opening it up and ask if there's a place you want us to begin thinking with you.
Sure. I can just say a brief thing about myself. And I was hoping you didn't keep reading my bio because I got so embarrassed. I was like, please just stop with this first and second line. I became a minister at 16 years old in a Black Baptist church. I grew up in the church my whole life. And so my first relationship with Israel and Zionism was actually through the church and was through reading the Bible. And so what I didn't know then, but do know now, is in terms of the relationship between religion and Zionism, religion and the movement for justice in Palestine, is a very complex relationship, particularly with Black people and Black Christians. And so historically, in many ways, the Bible was our history book. I was talking to Mumia Abu-Jamal earlier, political prisoner, and he had that wonderful phrase. He said, no, our Bible is a history book. And the particular book in the Bible that was so instrumental for Black people imagining freedom was Exodus. Of course, that's the story of the Israelites who were under Egyptian bondage. And except in this context, African Americans, Black Americans took ourselves to be the Israelites and took America to be Egypt. So that analogy, considering how instrumental the Black church has been in the history of Black people in this country, put us in a very complex relationship to this question of Zionism and Zion. And so there's been a long journey. I'll just start by saying, being a 16-year-old preacher and minister, knowing very little about the political context of what's happening in Israel and Palestine, not really actually knowing what Palestine was at all, going from that to now where through a lot of struggle and activism and tremendous teachers, some of whom you've had on, having a much better grasp of actually what's going on there and the role of religion in in this movement and in this violence. Just want to start there, but I'm open to any questions. I have lots to share, but it's open to questions.
So you actually touched on one of my questions, and maybe we'll come back, but you sort of raised another question for me. And so it sounds as if there's an interesting maybe tension, maybe dialogue, maybe something else. I'm not sure what the relationship is, but between long-standing, I mean, decades and decades long-standing Black solidarity from the so-called US or North America with Palestine and Palestinian liberation, and then what you described as this sort of framing or understanding or influence of Black church. So I wonder if you might talk about that relationship, or if that would be interesting to you to talk about, and if not, we can move in another direction.
No, I mean, Black Palestinian solidarity was a part of the story that I never heard. I had heard, like many of us, probably, stories of Black Jewish solidarity, especially during the civil rights movement. I think perhaps one of the most famous examples would be Dr. King, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., standing alongside Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. And that image is really, I think, imprinted on the imagination. And of course, you have Jewish college students going to the South in the 1960s to help Black people register to vote. These are stories that are very important stories because they're historically accurate and they are very much a part of the Black freedom struggle. However, there's another part of the story which is oftentimes not told, not known, or purposely buried because of the potential that it has for liberation struggles today. And that's the story of Black Palestinian solidarity. I think of Palestine as an essential chapter of the larger Black freedom struggle, which has always been global. And so we have a long tradition of standing alongside the most vulnerable, the most oppressed across space and across time. I mean, we can think about so many examples. When Britain colonized the Indian subcontinent, you had Black activists and intellectuals like W.E.B. Du Bois and Paul Robeson, who critiqued the British imperialism on the subcontinent. When we have the Vietnam War, you have, who I just mentioned, Dr. King, April 4th, 1967, stands up on the Riverside Church pulpit, and he critiques the U.S.'s war in Vietnam and makes connections between the amount of money that we were spending on the war alongside the neglect, the institutional neglect of schooling and of all kinds of, fundamental resources that will help Black communities right here. We can think about, of course, apartheid South Africa, which was one of the major ways that a lot of Black activists were entering into this broader struggle. And so you have all of these connections that are being made. I mean, when Italy invaded Ethiopia, you had Black activists, Black women activists like Ella Baker, who was flooding the streets of Harlem alongside other Black folks who was critiquing Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. And then in 2014, when Ferguson exploded, white police officer Darren Wilson shoot and kills Black teenager Michael Brown, you see this once again, particularly in the context of Palestine. And so I was one of those kids in the street in 2014. I had just graduated from seminary, and I was watching TV and on social media, and alongside everybody else, I was getting so angry about what was happening. Ended up going to Ferguson in St. Louis, and it was there that I was actually tear gassed, as many other people were. And there was a co-founder of a group called the Dream Defenders, which is an amazing group. If you don't know about the Dream Defenders, please look them up. One of the co-founders is a Palestinian American, and he was telling us that the same tear gas canisters that the Ferguson police and the St. Louis police, alongside many police departments across the country, the same tear gas canisters they were using were also being used on Palestinian protesters and Palestinian people in the context of the occupation and the settler colonial project there. So that blew my mind. I'm like, wait, I thought Israel was God's plan. That's what I learned when I was 16 as a minister. Now it's opening my mind through real experiences in the streets. And so I think that's important to understand, that Palestine is a part of that broader tradition of internationalism. Black people, of course, stood up with the landless farmers movement in Brazil. You can talk about standing up with indigenous people in Standing Rock. And so there's so many examples, and there's really, I think of Fannie Lou Hamer. Ella Baker's important. Fannie Lou Hamer, I think she says it best when she said, nobody's free until everybody's free. I think that's been a big proverb in Black struggle. And so another thing is that there are Black Palestinians. They're Afro-Palestinians. And so it's so funny. Even Black people will ask me, why should Black people care about, what's happening in Palestine? I'm like, well, there's Black people in Palestine. There's a small but rich community of Black Palestinians, Afro-Palestinians, who live in the Muslim quarter, many of whom were religious pilgrims, and many of whom were essential to the movement for justice in Palestine from the very beginning, before 1948 and during and after 1948. And that's really important to remember. So there's many other examples, but that's a part of it. And I would say one more. I know I'm talking a lot, but I get really excited about talking about Black internationalism. Of course, our Black folks' relationship to Zionism is complex, but it wasn't just complex because of the biblical story of Exodus. It was also complex because Black people, many of whom saw this as a real national liberation project. And as a group of people who were trying to find some place to be safe in our context, a place to have dignity, amidst a history of racial domination, there was a resonance between another oppressed group of people who in our minds were looking for Zion and in the context of Babylon, to use those kind of analogies. That story is oftentimes told in the mainstream. So you have a Dr. King, who's constantly quoted by the religious right, by the political right, and even by liberals, and use sound bites to say, well, and of course, whatever Dr. King says, all Black people should, it represents all Black people somehow, which I think is ridiculous. But what's not told is that after 1967, when the military occupation is created, which is still firmly intact, many Black people began to shift on that relationship. So you have the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee writing that essay, The Palestine Problem, and really critiquing what's happening in there. You have the Black Panther Party, which analogized Black people as living in an internal colony, understanding the relationship between Black and Palestinian struggle. You have Malcolm X, who goes to Gaza and who writes that, classic essay, Zionist Logic. This is oftentimes not told. You have Toni Morrison, you have June Jordan, you have Muhammad Ali, you have James Baldwin, you have so many Black activists who, especially after 1967, but some of whom before, begin to stand up for Palestine. So I think that's a part of it. And there have been many Palestinians who've also stood up for Black folks. So Black Palestinian solidarity is not a one-way street, it's a two-way street. And so you have examples that are extremely important. You have Association of Arab American University graduates who spotlighted these economic and military engagements and arrangements between Israel and apartheid South Africa. You have activist groups like the Organization of Arab Students who invite Stokely Carmichael to their national convention. Also lobbying Shirley Chisholm in 1972 during her presidential run. You have Arab American activists who formed an Arab Workers Caucus in Michigan, and many of those labor formations were modeled after Black radical labor unions. So that's also an important story to tell. And in 2014, which I mentioned, you have activists like Bassem, who was on the front lines, a Palestinian protester in St. Louis, who were on the front lines of the protests there. And so I think thinking about Black Palestinian solidarity in both ways is really important.
Yeah. And I'm hearing so multiple things, if maybe I can pull it together, one being that solidarity is a reciprocal relationship and that it is both studied. So I hear you describing, reading a significant history, and also it's studied in the streets, in the work of collaboration. So you studied a history as you were protesting with alongside other people. And I wonder if you might bring those sort of frameworks and tell us the story of right now for you. So how you're learning in your sort of study in organizing and activism from and with other people, how that's connecting to the long tradition of Black internationalism, and then this shared liberation struggle with Palestinian peoples everywhere, and sort of what is emerging right now for you and how you're organizing through that learning.
Yeah, I mean, I immediately think of Robin D.G. Kelley, who someone described as the jazziest historian in America, I would say on earth. But Robin D.G. Kelley has a phrase that he said he put on his desk as an educator: love, study, struggle, in that order. And so I think it's, for me, really in that framework that I find myself today, that I found myself in all of my journey of activism. Study is important because in order for us to address a problem or a crisis, we have to understand exactly what that problem or crisis is. And sometimes we're actually think that, for example, like this started in October 7th. And so if our starting point of the crisis is October 7th, then the limits of our demands would be a ceasefire and humanitarian aid. But if we understand that we have to go back to 1967, for example, to understand the military occupation, and then go even further back to 1948 and understanding the Nakba, the catastrophe, and going back again to 1917 and understanding the Balfour Declaration and how essentially Britain just gives the green light for a Jewish homeland on Palestinian land. And so, and then you can go even further back, but understanding, having political clarity about what's happening is extremely important. I learned, for example, through political education, it's not a religious conflict, which is oftentimes a kind of mainstream way of thinking. Oh, this must be between Jews and Muslims. This is about land. This is about resources. This is about domination and control. This is about geopolitical interests, oil, and things like that. And so I've learned most of that outside of the classroom. And I've learned the formal classroom, and I've learned most of that in collective study with other activists. And so when I was in Ferguson, Robin Kelley came to Ferguson during a meeting that we had and basically told us about Freedom Dreams, his book, Freedom Dreams, and how I didn't know what the word tradition meant in the way he was describing it. And so looking and saying, oh, we're a part of something that's been in the making for centuries, it completely changed my idea, one, of the magnitude of the problem. We're not dealing with a problem, we're dealing with a catastrophe that's been ongoing, but also made me realize the magnitude of the freedom liberation movement that has been in the making for so long. And so I believe that the best forms of education are collective. I believe the best forms of education encourage curiosity. Sometimes, we can read some tweets or some Instagram posts and it's like, I got it, we're scrolling through on our couch or whatever. And that's cool. And I'm not knocking that, any kind of information we can get, but real political education happens through struggle with other people with real concrete problems in mind. Okay, so we want a ceasefire. How does that happen? Well, some folks said, well, we'll stop a ship that has actual armed weapons on it because one way to have a ceasefire is to just stop the fire. We're going to stop the ship. So that takes, I think, really collective study. The Black Panther Party is oftentimes seen as some gun-toting Black kids who hated cops. They did hate cops for good reasons. But they also had the rifle in one hand and they had a law book in the other hand. When they would do cop watching, which is also a part of a longer tradition, they understood the laws in California, which informed their ability to organize. Of course, even Bobby Seale and Huey Newton were college students. They were at Merritt College. They were swept up in student activism and organizing coming out of San Francisco State, where you have the first Black Studies department. So there's a long tradition of collective activist-based study that has what are the ways that the world is organized that devalues people, and how do we then take our knowledge of how the world works, as Marx says, to change it. The point is not to just understand it, but to change
it. I know that my dear friend, Dr. Elon Dancy, who co-created this with me, is sitting very happy right now because you're singing his song. So we're appreciating everything you're saying.
Awesome.
I want to ask though about the role of religion, religious organizing, spirituality, because while you made the important point that what is happening in this genocide, the long colonization, the long genocide, is not about religion. Liberation, it has many dimensions that are religious and spiritual for many people. And I think particularly as we're talking to educators, there's this sort of, fake separation of church and state, that's framework. And I think educators can struggle with how to think about the role of religion, organized religion, religious organizing.
Yeah.
So, right. And yet it's central to liberation movement. So how might people be thinking about all that you just said, right? Study, struggle, all that work, but through the context of liberatory religious organizing?
Yeah, I think that, and let me try to clarify, it's not that this does not have anything to do with religion, but it's that it is not fundamentally a religious conflict. It's not the best way to think about what's happening, but it's deeply informed by religion, for sure. And we see that in many ways. One, we can just talk about the side of injustice. You have the rise of white Christian nationalism. I actually just read that over half of Republicans believe that the United States of America should be a Christian nation. I put that in quotes because religion is a site of contestation. You have Christian Zionism, this idea that there's a biblical promise for Jewish people to have a homeland, and that the creation of Israel in 1948 was the fulfillment of that promise. You have groups like CUFI, Christians United for Israel, which are some of the most powerful lobbying groups in the United States of America, who literally organize on HBCU campuses, historically Black colleges and universities. And what they do is they go and they especially recruit the student leaders, SGA presidents, so on and so forth, and say, hey, there's a free trip to Israel that we'll take you on. And, of course, you Black, first in your family go to college, yeah, I'll go to Israel. And through that process are also indoctrinating them and politicizing them in the very wrong direction. I think thinking about how not just religious right and not just the political right, but the establishment has used religion in many ways to beef up white Christian nationalism and Christian Zionism. I also think, as you said, that it's important for us to know that religion has been used, yes, as a site of oppression, but also as a site of liberation. And there's a long tradition. We can think about people like David Walker, in the context of slavery. He writes his appeal in 1829. And central to his appeal is this idea that Black people should read the Bible in liberatory ways to fight against slavery. You have Nat Turner. This was a preacher. This was an itinerant minister. You have Denmark Vesey, who was central to the building of the AME Church. So when Dylan Roof kills the 9 people at Mother Emanuel, which Denmark Vesey helped found, we have to understand this long tradition, not just of church bombings, but of Black people who have been fundamental to liberation movements, from slave insurrectionists all the way through the 1960s movements to today. I think that's extremely important. There is a Black liberation theology tradition, which James Cone is one of the founders of, who are using religious scripture and symbolism and stories on the side of the oppressed for Black folks and across the board. You have people like Reverend Jeremiah Wright, who was Obama's former pastor, which he lambasted, after he said some unkind words about the United States of America, who has stood up for Palestine for throughout his entire ministry. And then you have collective groups who are organizing right now. One of my most exciting things is watching Jewish Voice for Peace. Jewish Voice for Peace, the organization, are a group of primarily Jewish activists who are fighting, and promoting anti-Zionism, which is so important because it shows, one, that Israel does not speak for all Jews. And it also shows that there are deep, beautiful traditions within Judaism that people are pulling on, like Jewish Voice for Peace, to promote a world of justice and of freedom. And so this very same religion that can be used to justify oppression is the very same religion that could be used to fight for freedom. And we see that in Jewish traditions and organizing. We see that in Muslim traditions and organizing. We did a march here in DC a few weeks ago, and there was thousands of Muslims who came and descended on the National Mall and who actually had Friday prayer. We invited an imam to come to this march and rally about a ceasefire and humanitarian aid and ending the occupation, and using that as a space of prayer. So it's really amazing for me to see that, and it's really encouraging to know that the conservatives, that the religious right, that even the liberal establishment does not have a monopoly on what it means to be moral, what it means to be Jewish, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, anything, and that we have that option.
Thank you for that.
Of course.
I think that, many people on the call would gain quite a bit from hearing about your organizing right now, sort of what you're doing right now, kind of on the ground, who it's with, what the strategies are, where you're aiming, what you're learning.
Yeah, I'm so blessed to be working with the best organizers in the country and around the world. Just to shout out some, in case some folks want to look up some of these organizations. Of course, the Dream Defenders, who I organize with, but also the Rising Majority. Shout out to the Rising Majority, the Movement for Black Lives, of course. We have the American Muslims for Palestine, AMP, who I talked about. Jewish Voice for Peace, which has been really fundamental to a lot of these actions, direct actions in particular. So many organizations, of course, the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, USCPR, an amazing organization, which actually Ahmed, who co-founded the Dream Defenders, who took me to Palestine for the first time, is now the ED. So I've been working with a range of organizations, primarily doing two things. One is faith-based organizing, so mobilizing faith communities to really show just that there's a tradition, interfaith tradition of people of faith, people of conscience who believe that their religious practice is about freedom and justice. And then the other is around Black Palestinian solidarity. And so this huge march that happened on Saturday, myself, Derica Purnell, a lot of the organizations that I just mentioned, we organized something called Dear Gaza, Love Notes on Black Palestinian Solidarity. And we had people from all over the country, many of whom were a part of the march, come to the Culture House in DC. And it was a space for people to exhale, for people to grieve, for people to celebrate, for people to learn, for people to act. And it was all revolved around writing letters to Gaza. Whatever was on your heart, it wasn't, you didn't have to be an academic. You didn't have to read a book. You just had to have something in your heart that you knew you wanted to share. And so we had, for example, like 15 or 16-year-old student who was there with, what is the name of the organization? Power U is the organization. And she got up and shared her letter. We had a mother get up and share their letter. And so that was really something special. And we actually have a website, deargaza.org, and we're going to be building that out. But there is space for you all to write letters, or for your students to write letters, for all the educators who are here. You can upload it if they write it physically, or you can write it right in the chat. So we're going to be collecting those letters as a letter writing project, and then using them, trying to do exhibits, for example, in local communities, obviously having a virtual home for them. So those are kind of the two spaces, but rapid response organizing, you do what you got to do. That's what that is. Anybody who organizes, no, you pick up chairs, you go get food, you go to Target to make sure that, the protest has everything you need, make sure people have water. That's the beauty of organizing and protesting to me, because it's not just about whether we win our demands. It's about what kind of people we become in the process of making those demands. And me protesting in the streets fundamentally changed who I am. I became really baptized by the possibility of freedom, being alongside others, knowing that I'm not alone, knowing that the world need not be this way, knowing that people are willing to go out into the streets. Remember 2020? People risked their lives with masks on their face, went outside and said, we're not doing this. We're not doing, and that, to me, that was one of the greatest protests in American history during a global pandemic, one of the deadliest pandemics in over a century. If that doesn't tell you that there's something else is possible, then I don't know what will,
I just want to say back, what you said was so profound. Asking what kind of people do we become in the process of making demands, and then being baptized by the possibility of freedom. Just wow, profound words to give to us. So thank you for those.
Thank you.
And I also want to say that we've kept you past the time we said we would. I do want to give you space to say anything in closing that you would like to say to folks on the call. But I'm really grateful for your time with us.
Oh, I'm grateful too. I'm really happy to be here. It makes me feel like, just it's a blessing to know that, we're all in this together. I just want to show a lot of appreciation and love and solidarity for educators on every level, in and out of the classroom, pre-K all the way through higher education and beyond, for mothers and parents who are trying to figure out how to explain this. My partner has 2 children, and they pray about this. We learn about it during the day and pray about it at night. So I just want to show so much appreciation. I know many of us are underpaid or not paid. Many of us are trying to fight just to make ends meet, to be able to have enough to sustain ourselves. And for so many of us are also taking their time, their energy to also fight this battle. I think it says a lot about, I think, the best of our tradition as educators, as those who have been in and out of the classroom doing this work. And so just want to encourage everyone to keep on fighting. It's not a coincidence. I'm going to speak about my tradition. It's not a coincidence that during the height of chattel slavery, they cut off people's fingers and hands for learning how to read. It's not a coincidence that Carter G. Woodson, the founder of Negro History Week, which became Black History Month, it's not a coincidence that he said lynching starts in the classroom. And it's not a coincidence that enslaved folks would create Sunday schools, these spaces of learning as they were running, these spaces of learning as they were fighting, and understanding that the classroom as a global place where we learn lessons from every experience in our life is central to the kind of world we want, to the kind of people we want to be, and really to what makes life worth living. So shout out to y'all.
We are so fortunate that you closed out our 2 days. Thank you for those words. Thank you for the inspiration, the guidance, and just thank you for all your work on the ground and with others. And we're lucky to share with you and are deeply appreciative.
Thank you. Thank you all. I appreciate it.
Thank you all for being with us. I know some of you were with us for 2 days, so thank you for being here and learning and listening and being in the struggle.